I need to tell you about a man who died on a cold October morning in 1878 in a place that no longer exists on any map. His name was William Godfrey, and what happened to him that day would become America's most carefully buried secret. But here's what they don't want you to know. William Godfrey wasn't just executed for witchcraft. He was the last man in America to hang for it. And his story reveals that the witch trials never actually ended. They just moved underground. I've spent 3 years tracking down this story, digging through archives that were supposed to have been destroyed, following paper trails that led to dead ends, and interviewing descendants who were sworn to secrecy. What I discovered will shake everything you think you know about American history and prove that some chapters of our past are too dark to ever see the light of day. Let me take you back to how I discovered this story. I was researching obscure legal cases in post-Civil War America when I found a single line in a court record from Millerville, Pennsylvania, a small mining town that was wiped off the map in 1882. The entry was brief, almost casual. Commonwealth versus William Godfrey. Conviction under colonial statute 1647 sentence. Death by hanging, executed October 31st, 1878. Colonial statute 1647. I never heard of it, but something about that date made my blood run cold. 1647 was right in the heart of America's witch trial period. Why would a colonial law about witchcraft still be active in 1878, nearly 2 centuries after Salem? That single line entry haunted me for weeks. I had to know more. What I found next changed everything I thought I knew about American justice. Colonial Statute 1647, Section 12, was Pennsylvania's original witchcraft law, written by Quaker settlers who had fled religious persecution in England only to create their own version of it in the New World. The law was simple and brutal. Any person who shall practice the detestable arts of witchcraft, sorcery, or necromancy, or shall consult with familiar spirits, shall be put to death. But here's the shocking part. This law was never officially repealed. While other states quietly removed their witchcraft statute from the books, Pennsylvania simply forgot about theirs. It sat dormant for over 2 centuries, like a loaded gun waiting for someone desperate enough to use it. That someone was District Attorney Marcus Whitmore, a man whose ambition was matched only by his ruthlessness. In 1878, Whitmore was facing a re-election campaign that wasn't going well. The people of Millerville were angry about unsolved murders, unexplained deaths, and a series of mining accidents that had claimed dozens of lives. They wanted someone to blame, and Whitmore was prepared to give them exactly what they wanted. William Godfrey was the perfect scapegoat. A 43-year-old widower who lived alone on the outskirts of town, Godfrey had always been different. He was educated in an era when most miners couldn't read. He spoke with a slight accent that suggested European origins, and he had an unsettling habit of predicting accidents before they happened. When the Henderson mine collapsed in August 1878, killing 16 men, Godfrey had warned the workers not to go into that particular shaft just 3 days earlier. When I finally tracked down Godfrey's story, I realized I wasn't just looking at a forgotten legal case. I was looking at a deliberate cover-up that went all the way to the highest levels of Pennsylvania state government. The trial that condemned William Godfrey to death was a mockery of justice so complete, so carefully orchestrated, that it makes the Salem witch trials look fair by comparison. The accusations against Godfrey began in September 1878, just weeks after the mine collapse. Sarah Henderson, the widow of one of the dead miners, claimed that Godfrey had visited her in a dream and confessed to causing the cave-in. Within days, other townspeople came forward with similar stories. They said Godfrey had the evil eye, that his touch could make crops fail and livestock sicken. They claimed he kept familiar spirits in the form of black cats and spoke to the dead in ancient languages. But as I dug deeper into the case files, I found something that made my stomach turn. The accusations against Godfrey weren't random superstitions from ignorant townspeople. They were carefully crafted lies, planted and nurtured by people who knew exactly what they were doing. District Attorney Whitmore had studied the Salem trials. He knew what kind of evidence would be needed to secure a conviction under colonial law, and he was prepared to manufacture it. The key witness against Godfrey was a woman named Rebecca Morris, a recent widow who claimed Godfrey had approached her with an offer to bring her dead husband back from the grave in exchange for her soul. Morris's testimony was detailed, compelling, and completely fabricated. I know this because I found her original statement to the police, written in her own hand, where she admitted that D.A. Whitmore had coached her on exactly what to say. The confession was buried in a private collection of papers that weren't supposed to exist. But Morris wasn't the only manufactured witness. Whitmore had recruited dozens of townspeople to testify against Godfrey, promising them money, jobs, and protection in exchange for their cooperation. The man they painted in court wasn't William Godfrey, the lonely widower. It was William Godfrey, the devil worshipper, the man who danced with demons and made pacts with Satan himself. The trial began on October 15, 1878, in a courthouse that was packed beyond capacity. Judge Cornelius Bradford, a man who had built his career on high-profile convictions, presided over proceedings that would have been laughable if they weren't so terrifying. The prosecution called 47 witnesses, all of whom testified to Godfrey's supernatural powers and evil intentions. The defense called none because Godfrey's court-appointed lawyer, Thomas Mitchell, was secretly working with the prosecution. I found Mitchell's private correspondence with D.A. Whitmore, letters that reveal the entire trial was scripted from beginning to end. Mitchell was promised a judgeship in exchange for throwing the case, and he delivered exactly what was expected of him. His defense of William Godfrey consisted of half-hearted objections and a closing argument that lasted less than 10 minutes. The evidence presented against Godfrey would have been laughable in any legitimate court. Witnesses claimed they had seen him fly through the air on moonless nights. They said he could make himself invisible and that he kept a book written in blood where he recorded the names of his victims. One woman testified that Godfrey had turned her milk sour by looking at her cow, while another claimed he had caused her chicken to lay black eggs. But the most damning testimony came from a man named Joshua Crane, who claimed to have seen Godfrey performing a satanic ritual in the woods outside town. Crane described in vivid detail how Godfrey had drawn a pentagram in the dirt, lit candles at each point, and summoned a demon that appeared as a giant black dog with glowing red eyes. According to Crane, Godfrey had made a pact with this demon, trading the souls of Millerville's miners for supernatural power. What Crane didn't know was that I would eventually track down his grandson, who still had his grandfather's journal. In that journal, Crane admitted that his entire testimony was a lie, concocted by D.A. Whitmore and rehearsed for weeks before the trial. The satanic ritual Crane described was actually borrowed from a Gothic novel that Whitmore had read and thought would sound convincing to a jury of superstitious miners. The jury deliberated for exactly 17 minutes before returning a guilty verdict. When Judge Bradford asked if they recommended mercy, the foreman replied that they did not. William Godfrey was sentenced to death by hanging, the last man in American history to receive such a sentence for the crime of witchcraft. But Godfrey's story doesn't end with his conviction. What happened next reveals just how deep this conspiracy went and why his case has been buried for over 140 years. As soon as the verdict was announced, powerful forces began working to ensure that William Godfrey's execution would be carried out quickly and quietly, with as little public attention as possible. Pennsylvania Governor John Hartranft received dozens of letters from legal scholars and civil rights advocates, begging him to commute Godfrey's sentence or at least order a review of the case. These letters, which I found in the state archives, make it clear that educated people across the country were horrified by what had happened in Millerville. They understood that executing a man for witchcraft in 1878 was not just a miscarriage of justice. It was a national embarrassment that could damage America's reputation around the world. But Governor Hartranft was facing his own political pressures. The coal mining industry was Pennsylvania's economic lifeblood, and mine owners were terrified that any suggestion of supernatural forces at work would panic their workforce and shut down production. They wanted William Godfrey dead, and they were prepared to use their considerable political influence to make sure it happened. The execution was scheduled for dawn on October 31st, 1878, Halloween, though that wasn't the irony it might seem today. In 1878, Halloween was still primarily a harvest festival, not the supernatural celebration it would later become. The choice of date was purely practical. Governor Hartranft had received word that national newspapers were planning to send reporters to cover the story, and he wanted Godfrey dead before they could arrive. On the morning of his execution, William Godfrey was led from his cell in the Millerville jail to a hastily constructed gallows behind the courthouse. Fewer than 20 people were present to witness his death, all of them sworn to secrecy by D.A. Whitmore. No photographers were allowed, no reporters were present, and no official record was kept of Godfrey's final words. But I found someone who was there. Margaret Sullivan was 17 years old in 1878, the daughter of the jail's cook, and she watched William Godfrey's execution from her bedroom window. Before she died in 1963 at the age of 102, Margaret told her story to her great-granddaughter, who eventually shared it with me. What Margaret witnessed that morning haunted her for the rest of her life. According to Margaret, William Godfrey walked to the gallows with dignity, refusing the blindfold they offered him and declining to make a final statement. As the noose was placed around his neck, he looked directly at D.A. Whitmore and spoke just 4 words, "You know the truth." Then the trap door opened, and William Godfrey became the last man in America to die for the crime of witchcraft. But even in death, William Godfrey's story wasn't over. What happened immediately after his execution reveals the true scope of the conspiracy that had condemned him. Within hours of Godfrey's death, teams of men began systematically destroying every piece of evidence related to his case. Court records were burned, witness statements were shredded, and even the gallows was torn down and the wood scattered. The cover-up extended far beyond Millerville. I found evidence that federal agents visited newspapers across Pennsylvania, pressuring editors not to report on Godfrey's execution. Libraries were instructed to remove any books or documents that mentioned the case, and government officials were ordered never to discuss it publicly. By Christmas of 1878, it was as if William Godfrey had never existed. The town of Millerville itself was eliminated 4 years later, not by natural disaster or economic collapse, but by deliberate government action. In 1882, Pennsylvania seized the land under eminent domain, claiming it was needed for a state forest preserve. The remaining residents were relocated, the buildings were demolished, and the cemetery where William Godfrey was buried was moved to an undisclosed location. Today, there's nothing left of Millerville but a small historical marker that makes no mention of witchcraft trials or executions. But why go to such lengths to hide the story of one man's death? The answer lies in what William Godfrey's execution represented to the powerful interests that had orchestrated it. His death wasn't just about eliminating a convenient scapegoat. It was about testing whether colonial-era laws could still be used to control and terrorize the population in the modern age. The men who killed William Godfrey had discovered something that would have implications far beyond one small mining town. They had proven that in times of crisis, when people are scared and looking for someone to blame, even the most educated and supposedly civilized society can be manipulated into committing atrocities. The techniques they used, manufactured evidence, coached witnesses, complicit judges, and a controlled media, will become the blueprint for authoritarian control in America. I found evidence that the Godfrey case was studied intensively by government officials and law enforcement agencies across the country. They weren't interested in preventing future miscarriages of justice. They were interested in replicating the success of the Millerville operation. The systematic destruction of evidence, the coordination between different levels of government, and the complete media blackout were all techniques that would be used again and again in the decades that followed. The most chilling document I discovered was a report written by a federal investigator who had been sent to observe Godfrey's trial. The report, which I found buried in the National Archives, praised the operation as a masterful demonstration of population control through legal manipulation. The investigator recommended that similar techniques be used in other areas where undesirable elements needed to be eliminated without attracting national attention. This document revealed something that made my blood run cold. William Godfrey's execution wasn't an isolated incident. It was a test run for a much larger program of government-sanctioned terror. Throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s, dozens of people across America were quietly eliminated using similar techniques. Some were accused of witchcraft, others of anarchism, socialism, or simply being undesirable. All of them died in obscurity, their cases buried so deeply that most historians have never heard of them. But William Godfrey's case was special because it was the last time the witchcraft laws were used. After 1878, the conspirators realized that accusations of supernatural activity were becoming harder to sell to increasingly educated juries. They switched to more modern charges: treason, sedition, terrorism, but the techniques remained the same. Manufactured evidence, coached witnesses, complicit judges, and a controlled media. The legacy of William Godfrey's execution can be traced through American history like a cancer. The same men who orchestrated his death went on to careers in federal law enforcement, where they refined their techniques and pass them on to a new generation of operatives. The systematic destruction of evidence became standard practice. The coordination between different levels of government became more sophisticated, and the media blackouts became more complete and effective. By the early 1900s, the methods pioneered in Millerville had evolved into a sophisticated system of government control that could eliminate any individual or group that posed a threat to established interests. The techniques were used against labor organizers, civil rights activists, political dissidents, and anyone else who dared to challenge the status quo. Most of these cases never made it to trial. The targets simply disappeared, their names erased from history as completely as William Godfrey's had been. But there were people who remembered. Throughout my research, I encountered descendants of Millerville residents who had been carrying family secrets for generations. They told me stories passed down through whispered conversations and deathbed confessions, stories of a man who died for crimes he never committed in a town that was erased to hide the truth. One of these descendants, a woman named Catherine Brennan, had inherited a trunk full of documents that her great-great-grandmother had hidden before fleeing Millerville in 1879. Among these documents was a letter written by William Godfrey himself, smuggled out of his jail cell just days before his execution. In this letter, Godfrey revealed truths about his case that had been buried for 140 years. According to Godfrey's letter, he knew exactly why he was being framed and by whom. He had discovered evidence of massive corruption in the mining industry, including safety violations that had directly caused the Henderson mine collapse. District Attorney Whitmore and several prominent mine owners were profiting from these unsafe conditions, cutting corners that cost miners their lives while lining their own pockets with blood money. Godfrey had been planning to expose this corruption when the witchcraft accusations began. The timing wasn't coincidental. It was a desperate attempt to silence him before he could reveal the truth about who was really responsible for the miners' deaths. The supernatural charges were chosen specifically because they would make Godfrey appear insane and unreliable, discrediting any evidence he might present about industrial corruption. But Godfrey's letter revealed something even more disturbing. He wasn't the first person to discover evidence of this corruption, and he wasn't the first to be silenced. Over the previous 2 years, at least 6 other people had died under suspicious circumstances after stumbling onto information about unsafe mining practices. Some died in accidents, others from sudden illnesses, and one simply disappeared without a trace. The witchcraft trial was just the most dramatic example of how far these conspirators were willing to go to protect their secrets. They had discovered that in a town full of superstitious miners, accusations of supernatural evil were more effective than traditional methods of intimidation and murder. Why arrange an accident when you could stage a trial that would not only eliminate your enemy, but also serve as a warning to anyone else who might be tempted to ask uncomfortable questions? Godfrey's letter also revealed the true extent of the conspiracy against him. The plot involved not just local officials like D.A. Whitmore and Judge Bradford, but also state politicians, federal agents, and powerful businessmen whose names would be recognizable even today. These men saw the Millerville operation as an opportunity to test new methods of population control, and they were prepared to sacrifice an innocent man to advance their agenda. The letter ended with a prediction that has proved remarkably accurate. Godfrey wrote that his death would not be the end of the techniques being used against him, but rather the beginning of their widespread adoption. He predicted that future generations would see these methods used on a massive scale, with innocent people being destroyed by manufactured evidence and coordinated media campaigns. He warned that unless people learned to recognize and resist these techniques, they would spread like a disease through American society. Reading Godfrey's letter more than 140 years after his death, I was struck by how prophetic his words had been. The techniques pioneered in his case have indeed spread throughout American society, becoming standard tools of political and corporate warfare. The systematic destruction of evidence, the coordination between different power centers, and the manipulation of public opinion through controlled media have all become commonplace in modern America. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Godfrey's story is how completely it has been erased from history. Despite the fact that his execution represented a watershed moment in American jurisprudence, the last time colonial witchcraft laws were used to take a human life, virtually no one knows his name or his story. This erasure wasn't accidental. It was the result of a deliberate, coordinated effort that continues to this day. I discovered evidence that as recently as the 1990s, government agencies were still working to suppress information about the Godfrey case. When historians at several universities began researching colonial legal practices in Pennsylvania, they were told that the relevant documents had been lost or destroyed in a fire. When genealogists tried to trace the descendants of Millerville residents, they found that many records had been inexplicably sealed or reclassified. The suppression of William Godfrey's story represents something larger and more disturbing than just covering up a historical embarrassment. It represents the ongoing effort by powerful interests to control the narrative of American history, ensuring that only approved versions of events reach the public. By erasing inconvenient truths like the Godfrey case, these interests maintain their ability to use similar techniques in the present without fear of historical context or public understanding. But the truth has a way of surviving even the most determined efforts to bury it. Throughout my research, I kept finding traces of William Godfrey's story in unexpected places. References in private letters, mentions in obscure legal journals, and most importantly, the memories preserved by families who refused to let the truth die with them. These fragments, when pieced together, reveal not just the story of one man's unjust death, but a pattern of behavior that has shaped American history in ways most people never realize. The techniques used to destroy William Godfrey have been refined and perfected over the decades, but their essential elements remain the same. Identify a target, manufacture evidence, coordinate the prosecution, control the narrative, and eliminate all traces of the truth. Understanding this pattern is crucial for anyone who wants to understand how power really operates in America. The Godfrey case provides a blueprint for recognizing when these techniques are being used, and more importantly, for understanding how ordinary citizens can be manipulated into participating in grave injustices. The people of Millerville weren't evil. They were scared, confused, and looking for someone to blame for the tragedies that had befallen their community. The men who manipulated them understood this psychology perfectly, and they exploited it with ruthless efficiency. They turned neighbor against neighbor, created fear where none had existed, and convinced an entire community to participate in judicial murder. This is the real lesson of William Godfrey's story. It's not just about one man who died for crimes he didn't commit, or even about the powerful interests that orchestrated his death. It's about how easily ordinary people can be manipulated into committing extraordinary evil when they're afraid and looking for simple answers to complex problems. The techniques used in Millerville in 1878 are still being used today, in forms both subtle and obvious. Politicians still manufacture crises to justify extreme measures. Prosecutors still coordinate with media outlets to shape public opinion before trials begin. And powerful interests still work together to eliminate threats to their control, using whatever legal or extra-legal means are necessary. But there's hope in William Godfrey's story as well. The fact that the truth has survived 140 years of determined suppression proves that even the most powerful conspiracies have limits. The people who remembered, who preserved documents and passed down stories, who refused to let the truth die completely, they're the real heroes of this tale. Their courage in preserving these memories, often at great personal risk, ensures that William Godfrey's death was not completely in vain. His story serves as a warning to future generations about the dangers of unchecked power and manufactured fear. It reminds us that justice is fragile, that democracy requires constant vigilance, and that the price of freedom is eternal skepticism of authority. As I finish telling you William Godfrey's story, I'm struck by how relevant it remains to our current moment. The techniques used to destroy him, manufactured evidence, coordinated prosecution, media manipulation, and systematic cover-up, are all around us today. The only difference is the scale and sophistication of their application. William Godfrey died, believing that his story would serve as a warning to future generations. He couldn't have known that his case would be so thoroughly buried that most people would never hear it. But perhaps that makes his warning even more important. If we don't learn from the injustices of the past, we're doomed to repeat them in the present. The last man hanged for witchcraft in America wasn't a practitioner of dark arts or a servant of evil. He was a whistleblower, a truth-teller, a man who died because he threatened the profits and power of men who valued money more than human life. His execution marked not the end of superstition in America, but the beginning of a new and more sophisticated form of persecution. William Godfrey's story reminds us that the real witchcraft in America has never been about supernatural powers or deals with the devil. It's been about the very human ability of powerful people to cast spells of fear and confusion over ordinary citizens, manipulating them into betraying their neighbors and abandoning their principles. The curse that William Godfrey placed on America with his dying breath wasn't supernatural. It was prophetic. He warned that the methods used to destroy him would spread throughout our society, poisoning the wells of justice and democracy. Looking at America today, it's hard to argue that his prophecy hasn't come true. But curses can be broken and spells can be dispelled. The antidote to the poison that killed William Godfrey is knowledge, memory, and the courage to speak truth in the face of power. By remembering his story and learning from his fate, we honor his sacrifice and protect ourselves from sharing it. William Godfrey died alone, abandoned by a community that had been manipulated into fearing him. But he doesn't have to remain forgotten. His story can live on as a reminder of what we're capable of when we allow fear to overcome reason, and as a warning of what we might become if we don't learn from the mistakes of our past. The last man hanged for witchcraft in America deserves to be remembered not as a victim, but as a teacher. His life was taken, but his lessons remain. And perhaps, if we listen carefully to what he's trying to tell us, we can ensure that no one else shares his fate.